name is Lane Kirkpatrick. I am a wildlife and conservation enthusiast. Let's talk a little bit about what the definition is of an endangered species that's faced with extinction. And it's basically defined as an animal that's threatened with an extinction throughout its natural range. In other words, the habitat from which it lives and survives. And so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, if we look at this particular chart over here, has labeled the extent of extinction through these categories, starting with the least concern, where we don't need to worry about a threat of extinction, all the way through to being completely extinct. So if we look at this again, it goes from least concern to near threatened to vulnerable. From vulnerable to endangered, critically endangered, like the orangutan was just labeled that a few months ago, to extinct in the wild. And we're actually going to talk about a couple of birds in that regard in one of our series, to completely extinct. So why should we be concerned about endangered species? Well, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has actually come out through all of the studies and scientific work done and said that about 25% of all plant and animal species on Earth are threatened with extinction, of course, over a long period of time. We can look at it another way. If we look at this chart, we now risk losing up to 50% of all land-based species in this century. So that's kind of shocking. It's certainly something to think about, and it deserves protection. So why do we have this this dilemma over the rest of the century? The major reason is habitat loss. And we have to look at, for example, why habitat loss is so important. This is the home of the animals, where they eat, they mate, they raise their young, they have their families, and when that disappears, it, of course, adds to the threat of extinction. And climate change enters into that. And we think that's going to become more and more important because it affects their habitats. So there are other reasons too, pollution, invasive species, and we're not going to talk so much about those. But the major reason is really the habitat loss. So that's a little bit of an introduction, and from here we're going to start talking about some specific animals. Yeah, we're going to start with a bird that you probably haven't heard of, the Socorro Dove. We're going to also talk about a bird that most of you have heard about, which is the condor. So anyway, a headline on All Things Considered. This was January of 2017. Move over sheep. Doves are returning home to the tiny island of Socorro. So where's this tiny island of Socorro? It's not a little island in the Rio Grande River down near Socorro, New Mexico. Rather, it's out in the middle of the Pacific. It's an island about 500 miles off the coast of Mexico, owned by Mexico, where this picture of the bird is out here. And it's sometimes called the Galapagos of Mexico because there's a wide variety of both marine and land-based birds and animals and fish in this particular area. In fact, there are more endangered species of birds and lizards there than there are in any other location in Mexico. So it's a very important area. So why is this important, the Socorro Dove? It's an important conservation project because it's the first known attempt to return a bird species in the wild to its native habitat because it's currently extinct on the island. So it's really an interesting story. So besides the Socorro Dove, there are 6 other varieties of threatened birds and animals there. The Socorro blue lizard, the shearwater, the Townsend's shearwater, and the Socorro parakeet. So a couple more pictures of the island just to show you it's green, it's semi-tropical down there. and to show you another picture of the island. And there are only about 45 people on the island. So the bird itself, let's take a look at this picture over here, is kind of a bluish, grayish, brown bird. Not particularly spectacular looking, but there's only about 150 of these guys left, all in captivity now. And we have about a third of those birds at the Albuquerque Zoo. And so what happened? How come they went extinct in the island? Well, what happened, the last bird that was seen there in the wild was 1972. And it became extinct because they brought sheep on the island. The sheep ate all of the grass and the native vegetation that was very important habitat for this bird and some of the others that are threatened. And also because they introduced cats. Cats love birds, and there's also mice there. And there was also some hunting. So finally the bird became completely extinct in the island. So, very luckily, in 1925, there were about 22 of these birds that were actually captured and brought into captivity. And they have flourished at several zoos in Europe, the United States, and our zoo here in Albuquerque. And so they've been kept alive. So what they decided was they're going to have this reintroduction programs with captive birds that have done very well. So what did they have to do to make it possible to reintroduce the birds? Well, they had to get rid of the sheep. And they're getting rid of the sheep right now. They're getting rid of the cats. They're getting rid of some of the mice. But the other part of it is they're revegetating with the native original vegetation that's so important to the habitat there. What I want to say is that over the course of the next few years, this bird will be reintroduced. There's only about 45 people on the island, so they're all well aware of the conservation program that's to happen. And again, it's going to be not only a good example of conservation and replacing endemic species, but I think a good story as to what can be done amid a lot of the bad stories of what we hear about extinct and threatened species. And we're going to talk about, right now, two types of condors, the Andean Condor and the California Condor. One of which was extinct in the wild and is actually being reintroduced in a very successful program. So starting with the Andean Condor, and we can take a look at some pictures. This is the world's largest bird. It actually is exceeded only in wingspan by the wandering albatross and two varieties of pelican and wing length, but this is the world's heaviest bird. And it's in the category of its population being vulnerable. So the Andean Condor actually ranges all the way from the very southern tip of South America, Terra del Fuego, and where you depart for Antarctica, all the way up to Colombia, pretty much along the entire range of the Andes Mountains. And what are some of its characteristics? If you look here, the very distinguishing characteristic is the white ring of light feathers around its neck. And we also look at it and we see that it's a member of the vulture family. And it's always the question of how come vultures don't really have any feathers on their neck? Well, think about where this guy has been feeding. Lots of carrion, and so they get a lot of bad stuff on their heads. And it's nature's way of protecting them from bacterial infections, because without feathers, it dries out quickly, and dehydration kills bacteria, and also allows the ultraviolet light from the sun to actually sterilize it. So that's one reason vultures all kind of have that without feathers necks. These are soaring birds. They have wide, long wings. So they ride the airwaves. And when these guys are out hunting for carrion, they can go 100, 150 miles in a day. And they're just riding the airwaves. They're masters of flying. In fact, they're not made to take off very quickly. If, for example, they have a big meal, they can barely get off the ground by flapping their wings. Fortunately, I've had the pleasure of seeing these down in Patagonia and South America, and I've seen a dozen of these big guys all feeding on a dead cow or something like that. So we're talking a little bit about what it eats. And if you can imagine, the bigger the dead animal, the happier the vulture. So the native animals down there, like the llamas, the guanacos, certainly traditionally over the centuries, those are the kind of animals that they would like. But with all of the ranchers down there, dead cows, dead horses are all these famous things for these guys to feed on. And if they're along the coast, like some of these condors are, they like seafood. They'd love to find a dead seal or something else that's washed up on the beach. But they're also basically, they'll eat anything that they can find. I mean, rabbits, dead birds, again, carry on. And I always like to throw a little bit of humor into these discussions whenever I can. So do you know why these guys are really such effective flyers?
Why?
Because all of their baggage is carry on. So anyway, these are great animals. Another interesting point regarding them is how long they live. Many of you know that parrots, for example, can live to be cockatoos 50, 75 years. Well, these guys typically live about 50 years old. But there was actually one recorded in a zoo in North Africa that lived to be 100 years old. So that's good and bad. It means, though, that the way that they've evolved in nature is they don't have young very often. And animals like rabbits that get eaten all the time have babies all of the time. It's just part of their survival. So one thing, of course, to remember is that they don't propagate real fast. We talked about the Andean Condor, but this is really interesting. The California Condor. This is actually the second largest bird in the world and the largest bird in North America. And it's critically endangered. The Andean Condor is vulnerable, but we were actually down to having only 22 of these birds left in captivity, completely extinct in the wild. And what's really neat about it is that we just celebrated the 1,000th chick that's actually been born from these birds. And of that, we have about 500 of them that are still alive in captivity and in the wild. So their characteristics are much like the Andean Condor, soaring birds, eating carrion, being able to travel long distances to find foods. And the range now that they've been reestablished is that we'll find these birds, California, Utah, Arizona, northern Mexico, and maybe someday maybe a little bit into New Mexico, which is really great. So if we take a look at the bird here, I love this picture because it really shows how big that bird is compared to that man over there. And I mentioned that they've been reestablished into the western states that I mentioned. Some good news is that last year in Zion National Park, where they had a mating pair of California condors, they suspected by the birds bringing food back to their nest that maybe they had a baby. So these guys, all the condors usually nest in cliffs, very inaccessible places. So they actually had to climb down a rope, and by gosh, there was a chick. And everybody celebrated, so the reintroduction program is really going quite well. So we talked about protecting condors. We talk about how. Well, certainly restricting hunting. But another thing that is trying to be done is to not use lead in ammunition. Because if something is shot, and it has lead beads from like shotgun shells or lead slugs in it, and the condor eats it, it will get lead poisoning. So right now, there's just a lot of word going out to hunters. They're trying to do it through education, probably more than the laws. But I love talking about this bird because, again, we always like to see examples of conservation where it's really working.